Warning. This video contains very graphic images, videos, and descriptions of crimes against humanity. This includes the murder and torture of various populations, in particular Jewish people and gay men. The material is heavy, not easy to hear, and may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is highly advised. The Holocaust is one of the most horrific events to take place in modern history. 6 million Jewish people were killed at the hands of the Nazis, but millions others were also killed, displaced, tortured, imprisoned, and stripped of their humanity for being themselves. The Holocaust is a very, very complicated topic, and I make no move to try to simplify that fact. The Holocaust is largely remembered for the attempted genocide of the Jewish population. There were, however, others who were used for prison labor, captured, and sometimes killed under the Nazi regime. These populations include people living with disabilities, political prisoners, Catholics, Romas, and gay men. And the people who double dipped in these identities were also treated far worse than the rest. Like I said, I make no move to minimize the attack specifically on the Jewish population, but today we look at the men who were persecuted under the Nazis and paragraph 175 for being homosexuals. About 50,000 men were persecuted under paragraph 175 and the Nazi regime. Between 10 and 15,000 were sent to concentration camps where most perished. My name is Bridget. Welcome to another episode of Queer History. I like to prioritize positive gay history, and these overall sad and disgraceful stories do highlight some really fantastic stories of queer perseverance. But think of today's video as a warning. The thing is, we might cover some things that sound familiar, things that might make us say, oh, perhaps history does repeat itself. The cycle of violence and the pyramid of hate is a continuum. The systematic eradication of a minority group of people was almost incredibly successful. If you were a Jew in 1945, well, you likely wouldn't be alive because 2 out of every 3 European Jews were dead. And that took place less than 100 years ago. History and the world do not change overnight. In fact, it takes generations for attitudes to change. Before the Nazis, Germany was a very progressive place. And it only took about 20 years to change all of that because the country was in a place of crisis. I encourage you to watch out for patterns of similar behavior because at the end of the day, we cannot fight for queer rights passively. We must fight for queer rights actively, and I hope this story will show you why that is so important. Now, let's set the scene. The Weimar Republic, which contains what we will be considering modern day Germany, saw lots of growth between 1918 and 1933. Germany had just lost a world war, so things were pretty chaotic. It was a big time of change, and change was happening everywhere in all aspects of life. Perhaps think back to a time of social revolution similar to the 1960s. Germany is burned bad after World War I. I'll say it again in a New Jersey accent. Germany was burned bad after World War I. Here's your recap. A bunch of monarchs vaguely related to each other got in a fight about who was going to enslave which people where and who had the bigger boat and guns. Childish things. And they sacrificed a ton of their little green army men to the pits of hell, and eventually everyone got tired and decided to blame Germany. In order to prove they were sorry and weren't going to do it again, hashtag LOLJK, they had to pay like a gajillion dollars to the empires who beat them, but they had no money. The war made the rich people and the government bankrupt, and the working class basically never had any money. The general population was frustrated because inflation was so high, they actually started to make kites out of their paper money. People were poor, hungry, dissatisfied with their government, but also still deeply protective of their nation, especially from quote unquote outsiders, because in their mind, these other powers beat them. And that's what you missed on Glee. So now World War I is over. The world is quote unquote free if you have the right money, the right religion, and are white, and a sense of partying has taken hold. Entertainment, the way we know it, came about during this time, but take into account that this means everything was new. Do not underestimate the impact of entertainment in history. It is so overlooked, and media provides a fascinating mirror into the time periods in which it was created. Anyway, things were changing. Blonde bombshell icon Mae West of the United States was arrested in 1926 for her Broadway play titled Sex. This production was far ahead of its time, and West starred, directed, and wrote the entire production herself. Mae West the next year put out two plays about cross dressing. The first was titled The Drag, a homosexual comedy in 3 acts, and focused on a closeted gay socialite. The Pleasure Man was her second play, which was raided by police and only lasted 3 shows. Mae West casted openly gay actors in both, which was against union rules at the time. The success of these shows and others proved that people were curious. The 1920s were a time of exploration in Europe and in the United States. Britain's Radcliffe Hall wrote The Well of Loneliness in 1928, a story about a lesbian in high society facing rejection, which had great sales and numbers. Life was difficult for gays and lesbians in the early 20th century, but Germany and Berlin in particular were an exception. German laws banning homosexuality were seldom enforced. Because paragraph 175 wasn't often implemented, gay men and women could easily be open in bars. The actual text of the law read, quote, "An unnatural sex act committed between persons of male sex or by humans with animals is punishable by imprisonment. The loss of civil rights might also be imposed." End quote. Gay culture thrived in Berlin. People from around the world traveled to Berlin to experience this queer culture. One survivor recounted the Schwanenberg, a popular club, and said, quote, "It was a dance club, a normal bar, but on certain days it was rented by homosexuals. Then there was much joy. There was homosexual dancing, and once in a while, just to get the queens going, someone would shout, 'The police are coming!' Everyone would hike up their skirts and run, but the police never really came. It is hard to imagine how wild it was in Berlin. Men danced with men, women danced with women. In Berlin, those were the golden years." End quote. The gay culture here is real. They even had a gay anthem called Das Lila Lied, or the Lavender Song, which was a German cabaret song. The lyrics read, "We're not afraid to be queer and different. If that means hell, well, hell will take the chance." They're also straight, uptight, upright, and rigid. They march in lockstep. We prefer to dance. We see a world of romance and pleasure. All they can see is sheer banality. Lavender nights are our greatest treasure, where we can be just who we want to be. End quote. New political and social ideas led to many groups advocating for less restrictive norms on gender and sexuality under the law and in public settings. This reform movement went hand in hand with other pushes to legalize prostitution, birth control, and abortion. Once again, sounding any bit familiar here? Before the Nazis came to town, about 1,000 people were arrested each year under paragraph 175, but very few actually were convicted and given a prison sentence. The government was seriously considering scrapping paragraph 175 altogether. Germany was at the forefront of scientific investigation and debate regarding sexuality and, to an extent, gender as well. Activists had gotten together to try to repeal or change this law, and they were led under Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, often known as the Einstein of sex. Hirschfeld was born in 1868 and was a German Jewish doctor. His advocacy and research of human sexuality became his life's work. If he could scientifically explain homosexuality, there would be no reason to persecute it under the law. In 1897, Hirschfeld founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee and put together a petition to repeal paragraph 175. More than 5,000 prominent members of German society signed the petition, including Albert Einstein, Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Rainier Maria Rilke, and Martin Buber. Unfortunately, the petition was unsuccessful. Hirschfeld additionally founded the Institute for Sexual Research in 1919, which attracted many scientists from around the world. Folks came here to see their facilities and it became internationally famous. The Institute for Sexual Research did a ton of pioneering scientific studies and held a positive reputation as an education center. It was a hub of cultural and sexual revolution and offered lots of sex-related services like birth control and marriage counseling. Hirschfeld also organized the first Congress for Sexual Reform in Berlin in 1921, and later this conference expanded to London and Copenhagen. Nazis were not really big fans of him because they thought he wanted homosexuality to thrive. Hirschfeld was also Jewish, which meant they cared even less about what he had to say. Queer culture thrived in many ways. There were growing gay networks which formed from friendship leagues. Here, people could publicly gather together at meeting places. El Dorado was the most popular gay bar in Berlin, and people published newspapers to educate the public. The newspapers printed short stories and poems and contributed to a growing sense of community. Anders als die Anderen, translated to different from the others, was the very first gay film, and it was written and produced in Germany in 1918. In this movie, a young violinist named Kurt is looking for a teacher and finds a man named Paul Korner. The two become romantically involved and attracted to one another, but Kurt's dad says he should not be. Kurt's parents take him to a doctor, and the doctor said to them, in a rough translation, "You mustn't think poorly of your son because he is homosexual. He is not at all to blame for his orientation. It is neither a vice nor a crime, indeed, not even an illness, but instead a variation, one of the borderline cases that occur frequently in nature. Your son suffers not from his condition, but rather from the false judgment of it. This is the legal and social condemnation of his feelings, along with widespread misconceptions about their expression." End quote. The film also recounts Corner's upbringing, and when he was caught with another male student, he likewise visited a doctor played by none other than Magnus Hirschfeld himself. In the film, he said to Corner, quote, "Love for one's own sex can be just as pure and noble as that for the opposite sex. This orientation is to be found among many respectable people in all levels of society. Only ignorance or bigotry can condemn those who feel differently. Don't despair. As a homosexual, you can still make valuable contributions to humanity." End quote. The movie ends, unfortunately, with Corner committing suicide and a call to action to repeal paragraph 175. And interestingly, the cinematographer on the film, who was named Max Fassenbender, 2 years previously worked on an early German production of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is like the definition of early 20th century gay shit. Now, don't get it twisted. Plenty of folks were still not too cool with the gays, and paragraph 175 is still in effect. Not all Germans were on board with the whole sex is now becoming less taboo thing. Some right wing and centrist politicians and mainstream religious organizations thought it was much too risque and immoral. Some of these groups blamed Jews and communists for corrupting German culture. Lots of these quote unquote normal members of society who were homophobic and anti Semitist also grouped these fringe members of society together. So the Nazis began crafting their case against homosexuality. The Nazis didn't actually say much about homosexuality in the beginning. Some Nazis, like Alfred Rosenberg and Heinrich Himmler, were very homophobic and openly so, but Hitler himself rarely spoke about it in public. Prohibiting homosexuality and the reinforcement of paragraph 175 was not even a part of the 1920 Nazi platform. So, why did the Nazis come to dislike the gays? The Nazis' main goal was to create an Aryan race and to get rid of anything or anyone who got in the way of this goal. Homosexuality in Germany means that there would be fewer German babies, and this meant a lower birth rate and therefore a weaker Germany. The Nazis' official newspaper said, quote, "Among the many evil instincts that characterize the Jewish race, one that is especially pernicious has to do with sexual relationships between siblings, men and animals, and men and men. These efforts are nothing but vulgar, perverted crimes, and we will punish them by banishment or hanging." End quote. The Nazis officially came out with this statement on the matter in 1928. Quote, "It is not necessary that you and I live, but it is necessary that German people live. And it can only live if it can fight. Life means fighting. And it can only fight if it maintains its masculinity. It can only maintain its masculinity if it exercises discipline, especially in matters of love. Free love and deviance are undisciplined. Therefore, we reject you. We reject anything that hurts our nation. Anyone who thinks of homosexual love is our enemy. We reject anything which emasculates our people and makes it a plaything for our enemies, for we know that life is a fight, and it is madness to think that men will ever embrace fraternally. Natural history teaches us the opposite. Might makes right. The strong will always win over the weak. Let us see to it that we once again become strong. But this we can achieve only in one way. The German people must once again exercise discipline. We therefore reject any form of lewdness, especially homosexuality, because it robs us of our last chance to free our people from the bondage that now enslaves it." End quote. So we can see here that they're really pushing the whole restoring law and order narrative, along with traditional values and purity. And once again, I will say, does this sound familiar? I'm telling you, purity culture only causes bad things to happen. It was hard for the general public to care because jobs and the economy were much more important to the average person, and the Nazis were delivering on that. Now, I can't in good conscience say I don't blame the public for letting this happen, because I certainly do. But when I'm with my students, I always try to tell them to put yourselves in the shoes of others and think through that person who you're judging. What have they been through to put them there? Did they lose family members in the war? Did they have brothers come home suffering from shell shock, the first big wave of PTSD from a war that barely served them as a people? Did their remaining family lose jobs from the economic collapse that followed? When your entire life crumbles and there is absolutely no reason for hope, you will often grab onto anything that provides an ounce of a better future. And that was Hitler for many of these people. In January 1933, Hitler is named Chancellor of Germany, and the very next month, homosexual rights organizations were banned. The first concentration camp to open under Hitler's regime was Dachau. It opened in March 1933, and among its first prisoners were men who worked in homosexual rights organizations in Berlin. In February 1933, gay and lesbian bars were closed and all publications with a homosexual audience were banned. Underground meeting places still operated, but it had to do so sneakily. Increased police surveillance made things very difficult. On May 6, 1933, Nazis stormed Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Research. Fortunately, Hirschfeld himself was out of the country at this time, but after this incident, he never returned. He died in 1935, and his gravestone reads his Latin motto, Per scientiam ad justiam, translating to through science to justice. Many of Hirschfeld's books, along with the movie he was in, were burned at the Nazi book burnings. In these early days, gays hoped this was just a flex to show the public that they meant business. Part of what gave them this hope was Ernst Röhm, a man who was one of Hitler's most influential deputies and a known homosexual. They thought as long as he is around, they can't in good conscience throw homosexuals in prison. Many considered him the second most powerful man in Germany. Röhm met Hitler in 1919, and the two quickly became each other's most trusted friends. And before you speculate, no, we do not have any confirmation that the two ever had relations. In the early days of Hitler's rise, he put together a paramilitary group. The purpose was to rough up dissenters, break up meetings of opposing political parties, and generally protect Hitler from revenge attacks. This group was known as the Sturmabteilung, or SA, and Röhm was its first leader. Rome himself didn't see his sexuality as contrary to Nazi ideals. He wanted to overthrow mainstream society, and sexual revolution was part of that. He said the prudery of his fellow Nazi party members, quote, did not seem very revolutionary, unquote, which, I mean, yeah, he was right about that. And this is the one and only singular time you will ever catch me agreeing with a Nazi. Anyway, as Hitler's popularity and the Nazis' power rose, he gained control of Germany's army. He wanted to merge the SA with the traditional military, but he had a suspicion that the traditional military men did not consider Rome a good leader because of his sexuality. One German general said, quote, "Rearmament is too serious and military too important to be left to hoodlums and homosexuals like Captain Rome." End quote. Because of this, Hitler began to reduce Rome's influence. Meanwhile, the rest of Hitler's cronies wanted to gain more power within the party. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, Reinhard Heydrich, the head of Nazi intelligence, and Hermann Göring, the head of the Air Force, came up with a plan to get Rome out of the picture. They created falsified documents that implicated Rome in a plot to stage a coup against the rest of the party, and this was all the evidence Hitler needed to take him out. This set into motion Operation Hummingbird, more commonly known as the Night of Long Knives, not to be confused with Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Rome was told that he and Hitler were to meet with the other SA leadership on July 1st, but instead, on July 29, 1934, Hitler and his SS guards arrested Rome. Röhm was put in Stadelheim prison, and on July 1st, he was given a pistol with a single cartridge and was told he had 10 minutes to kill himself or they would do it for him. To this, Röhm scoffed back and said, "Let Hitler do it himself." The guards came back 10 minutes later to find Röhm standing shirtless with his chest puffed out in defiance, and he was then shot. Author William L. Shirer wrote in his account, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, A History of Nazi Germany, quote, "After 14 stormy years, the two friends, who more than any others were responsible for the launching of the Third Reich, for its terror and its degradation, who, though they had often disagreed and had stood together in the moments of crisis and defeats and disappointments, had come to a parting of the ways, and the scar-faced, brawling batter for Hitler and Nazism had come to the end of his violent life." End quote. Many other SA men were killed that day, along with other opponents of Hitler's. And this was one of Hitler's first very successful nights and was the first great show of violence under Nazi rule. Rome's killing certainly sent the message that they were no longer, or perhaps were ever, playing around. Once Rome was gone, the Nazis could change the laws. The updated version of paragraph 175, passed on June 28, 1935, said, "A male who commits a sex offense with another male or allows himself to be used by another male for a sex offense shall be punished with imprisonment. Where a party was not yet 21 years of age at the time of the act, the court may in especially minor cases refrain from punishment. Penal servitude up to 10 years, or, where there are mitigating circumstances, imprisonment of not less than 3 months shall apply to 1. A male who, with violence or the threat of violence to a body and soul or life, compels another male to commit a sex offense with him or to allow himself to be abused for a sex offense. 2. A male who, by abusing a relationship of dependence based upon service, employment, or subordination, induces another male to commit a sex offense with him or to allow himself to be used for a sex offense. 3. A male over 21 years of age who seduces a male person under 21 years to commit a sex offense with him or to allow himself to be abused for a sex offense. 4. A male who publicly commits a sex offense with males or allows himself to be abused by males for a sex offense or offers himself for the same. An unnatural sex act committed by humans with animals is punishable by imprisonment. The loss of civil rights might also be imposed." End quote. This basically criminalizes all aspects of being gay. Police were instructed to go after people with previous sex-related criminal convictions as a way to reduce crime. And again, the number of things that are sounding familiar here is quite scary. Very suddenly, life was about to get pretty fucking hard for the gays. Even a touch between men could be seen as evidence of a homosexual relationship. Courts also ruled later on that even if it wasn't someone's intent to make a homosexual remark or move, they would still be sent to prison. You could even be convicted for a homosexual thought. Nazis made the laws retroactive, so even if you had done this stuff before it was illegal, you could still be caught and punished. Laws were put in place, like the laws against insidious slander, that encouraged neighbors and family members to spy on each other. Everyday citizens were expected to report this suspicious behavior just like they were required to with the Jews. Hotel owners would call about suspicious guests, even if it was just a passerby on the street. One woman was so mad at her boyfriend that she accused him of being gay and hooking up with his friend, and they were taken in and questioned by the police. Fortunately, these new laws were very effective in getting information on people. Once gay men were arrested, they were often tortured until they gave up the names of other gay men they knew. Afterwards, the prisoners were sent to concentration camps. Gays and lesbians had to hide who they were as much as they could. Some gays and lesbians married each other, other gay men married sympathetic female friends. Some also joined the army to avoid suspicion, but if you were found to be gay in the army, you would immediately be executed. Rudolf Brazda was born on June 26, 1913, in Brassen, Germany. His father worked in the mines and unfortunately passed away from a work-related accident when he was 7. Brazda wasn't wanting to follow in his family's professional footsteps and rather wanted to work in the male fashion industry. This, however, wasn't working out for him and he pivoted to train as a roofer. All things considered, Brazda's life was pretty easy. He began to meet many other gays and lesbians in the towns of Muselwitz and Altenburg. He met his boyfriend, Werner, at a local swimming pool. The couple moved in together and sublet from a Jehovah's Witness landlady who was totally cool with them and their lifestyle. They knew that if they kept things on the DL, they would most likely be able to keep living like this forever. They held a ceremony to celebrate their commitment to each other, even with Rudolf Brazda's family being present. He lived a very relatively carefree life. Rudolf Brazda first encountered German authorities in 1936 at Cafe New York, which was a gay hub in the city of Leipzig. The Nazi stormtroopers dragged out men from the club by their hair. Brazda himself wasn't arrested, but that certainly sent the message that gays were not welcome to convene in public. Werner, Brazda's boyfriend, decided to enlist to complete his compulsory military service. Brazda took a position with a Leipzig hotel. In 1937, Brazda was arrested again as a suspected homosexual and charged with unnatural lewdness. Werner was also tried and sentenced, but in a completely different city, and the two would never see or hear from each other again. After his second arrest, Brazda was sentenced to 6 months in prison and was exiled to Czechoslovakia. He was able to find work for a short time, but unfortunately, Germany invaded Czechoslovakia in 1938. He said, "We gays were hunted like animals. Wherever I went with my boyfriend, the Nazis were already there." He was once again imprisoned and given a 15-month sentence. Afterwards, on August 8, 1942, he was deported to Buchenwald concentration camp as prisoner number 7952. When he arrived at the camp, the prisoners were gathered and were instructed to bathe naked in a pool of what they called disinfectant. An SS officer pushed his head under the liquid, causing him to almost vomit. He was then given his prison uniform with the pink triangle stitched above his left breast. Brazda's life at Buchenwald can give modern historians a clear window into what life was like at concentration camps for gay men. Buchenwald housed close to 250,000 people from 1938 to 1945, and Brazda was one of 650 men sent there under paragraph 175. As a rule, they were often sent to do the grueling and dangerous work in the stone quarry, which was apparently really bad, and not many people made it out alive. Brazda recalled one gay man who gouged his eyes out so that he would be sent to the infirmary rather than the quarry, even though prisoners knew full well it was not uncommon to receive lethal injections to handicapped and injured patients. Brazda was able to survive because he was able to be friendly with capos. Capos are prisoners themselves who were seen as stand in guards. They were Jewish inmates who the Nazis forced to watch over prison labor or carry out administrative tasks. They were certainly perpetrators of the Holocaust, but they were just as equally victims. They were put in a moral dilemma and did what they had to do to survive. The capo Brazda met saved his life on many occasions and assigned him to less lethal work. Once, a Nazi officer struck Brazda in the face for incorrectly answering a question. 3 of his teeth were knocked out, and he received a sentence to death for the following day. Fortunately, the capo intervened and vouched for him, saying his skills as a roofer were very much needed. In March of 1945, it was evident the war was coming to an end, and camps began evacuations. Nazis sent prisoners on death marches deeper inside of what remained of German territory. Many died or were shot in this long haul, and Brazda thankfully once again caught the attention of a capo who stuffed him in the stables with some pigs. He lived there for 14 days, surviving on food smuggled to him by the capo until the camp was liberated on April 11th, 1945. Brazda felt very lucky to be free. He was so thrilled to begin his life the way he wanted to, free from the dictation of anyone else. Within the roofers at Buchenwald, he made many friends who were communists. One friend, Ferdinand, a Frenchman from the Alsace area of France, offered him a place to stay. He followed Ferdinand to France, where he began his new life. In France, Brazda met his lifelong lover, Edouard, at a costume ball. The two lived together until Edouard's death in 2002. Brazda actually didn't share his story publicly in 2008 when he saw a TV program about the Berlin monuments to pink triangle victims. He died a few years later in 2011, but he shared his story in the hopes of not forgetting the past with the youth. He said, "I am no longer afraid of anything. Millions of people were broken, but they did not destroy me." Nazis truly saw themselves as removing burdens from society. By burdens, we mean people who were not fit for the Aryan race. Mercy killings began in 1939 with young children with severe birth defects under the age of 3. Doctors were in charge of deeming them fit to live or fit to die. Later that same year, Hitler expanded the program to adults, and 70,000 people were killed in the first 2 years of the program. Their next target was institutionalized adults. Even if gay men fit the Aryan profile, they cannot be trusted for a few reasons. One, Nazis thought homosexuality was perhaps hereditary, which was a clear danger to the German population. Second, they obviously were not going to reproduce, which was another big no-no for the Nazis. Third, gay men were not seen as strong men. Nazis characterized all gay men as the stereotypical femboy who were not fit to be patriarchal men in society. And lastly, Nazis feared gays would recruit other men to the homosexual lifestyle. 5 years between 1935 and 1939 saw the largest number of homosexual arrests. About half of men arrested were convicted, and most men sent to the camps had multiple offenses or extenuating circumstances. Castration remained a popular punishment, and some could get their sentences reduced if they agreed to castration. Gestapo also compiled what they called pink lists. The Gestapo centralized the lists of gay men put together by many of the city police forces for the first time. This allowed Nazis to share the names of men suspected of being homosexuals. Police continued to raid homosexual meeting places and stole address books of arrested men. Police also underwent training and learned techniques on how to identify homosexuals. Telltale signs included feminine appearance, smelling nice, and wearing makeup or women's clothing. Pierre Seel was a flamboyant Frenchman who dressed in the Zazu style, which was a kind of style of resistance, if you will. By the age of 17, he was flaunting his lifestyle and individuality and exploring his homosexuality. Seel frequented Steinbach Square, a known gay area. Seel once had a sexual encounter there, which was not uncommon, but the man he was with stole his watch. Seel reported the incident to the police, but the cops did not care about his stolen watch, but rather made him feel like the criminal by interrogating him about why he was there in the first place. The police asked questions like, "How would your dad feel if he knew you were hanging out here?" His name was put on a list that would later be turned over to the Nazis. Seel found a partner he really liked named Joe, but sadly, Nazis invaded France in 1940. The Gestapo requested Seel's presence at headquarters, and when he arrived, he was with other men who also frequented Steinbach Square. The men were interrogated one by one and subsequently tortured in some of the most horrific ways you can imagine. The men had their fingernails ripped out, they were raped, and they were called filthy faggots. Peel said after, "At first, we managed to endure the suffering, but ultimately it became impossible. The machinery of violence accelerated. Outraged by our resistance, the SS began pulling out the fingernails of some prisoners. In their fury, they broke the rulers we were kneeling on and used them to rape us. Our bowels were punctured, blood spurted everywhere. My ears still ring with the shrieks of our pain." End quote. In his memoir, Seel recounted his concentration camp life. Nazis shaved the long hair of prisoners into the shape of a swastika. Seel and other prisoners were given a small blue bar to identify themselves as social outcasts and gays. Nazi guards woke up the prisoners at 6 a.m. to have moldy bread and then work in the quarries for 12 hours. Seel said he made sure not to talk to anyone, locking himself in isolation away from any sexual desire. Loudspeakers were also installed throughout the camps that would call upon prisoners for any number of reasons. Seel was often called on for medical experiments, and they wouldn't even know what the experiments were for. He and some other prisoners had needles injected into their nipples, which killed one prisoner right on the spot when the needle hit his heart. Most horrifying of all was when he saw his lover, Joe, and I think this best comes from his account himself, in which he said, quote, "Days, weeks, months wore by. I spent 6 months from May to November 1941 in that place where horror and savagery were the law, but I've put off describing the worst ordeal I suffered. It happened during my earliest weeks in the camp and contributed more than anything else to making me a silent, obedient shadow among the others." One day the loudspeakers ordered us to report immediately to the roll call. Shouts and yells urged us to get there without delay. Surrounded by SS men, we had to form a square and stand at attention, as we did for the morning roll call. The commandant appeared with his entire general staff. I assumed he was going to bludgeon us once again with his blind faith in the Reich, together with a list of orders, insults, and threats, emulating the infamous outpourings of his master, Adolf Hitler. But the actual ordeal was worse: an execution. Two SS men brought a young man to the center of our square. Horrified, I recognized Joe, my loving friend who was only 18 years old. I hadn't previously spotted him in the camp. Had he arrived before or after me? We hadn't seen each other during the days before I was summoned by the Gestapo. Now I froze in terror. I had prayed that he would escape their lists, their roundups, their humiliations, and there he was before my powerless eyes, which filled with tears. Unlike me, he had not carried dangerous letters, torn down posters, or signed any statements, and yet he had been caught and was about to die. What had happened? What had the monsters accused him of? Because of my anguish, I have completely forgotten the wording of the death sentence. Then the loudspeakers broadcast some noisy classical music while the SS stripped him naked and shoved a tin pail over his head. They then sicked their ferocious German shepherds on him. The guard dogs first bit into his groin and thighs, then devoured him right in front of us. His shrieks of pain were distorted and amplified by the pail in which his head was trapped. My rigid body reeled, my eyes gaped at so much horror, tears poured down my cheeks. I fervently prayed that he would black out quickly. Since then, I sometimes wake up howling in the middle of the night. For 50 years now, that scene has kept ceaselessly passing and repassing through my mind. I will never forget the barbaric murder of my love. Before my very eyes, before our eyes, for there were hundreds of witnesses. Why are they all still silent today? Have they all died? It's true that we were among the youngest in the camp and that a lot of time has gone by, but I suspect that some people prefer to remain silent forever, afraid to stir up memories like that one among so many others. As for myself, after decades of silence, I have made up my mind to speak, to accuse, to bear witness. End quote. Pierre Seel was released early in November 1941 for good behavior, but had to swear never to speak about what he experienced. At this time, he was only 18 years old and in just terrible shape. He and his family never spoke about his imprisonment or his homosexuality. And even worse, he was drafted in March of 1942 to fight against the very people he wanted to support. After the war, Seel married a woman and had 3 kids, but his double life caused him to fall into a depression and he became an alcoholic. After Kohout's book, which we will talk about in a little bit, he came forward as the first French citizen to speak about his gay experience in the Holocaust. He wrote a memoir in 1994 called I, Pierre Seel, Deported Homosexual, and dedicated it to Joe. Pierre Seel passed away in 2005. So, who was behind all this? A man by the name of Heinrich Himmler, who literally looks like a fucking weasel you just want to punch multiple times over and over again. You would never look at him and think evil mass murderer mastermind, but more like sad accountant. Anyway, Himmler was the overseer of the concentration and extermination camps as well as the mobile killing squads. He helped push the idea that sex was a matter of national concern. He said, quote, roughly 7 to 8% of men in Germany are homosexual. If that is how things remain, our nation will fall to pieces because of that plague. Those who practice homosexuality deprive Germany of the children they owe her, end quote. On October 26, 1936, he founded the Reich Central Office to combat homosexuality and abortion. He specifically tied these two ideas together as an emphasis on it being wrong to not want children. Again, sound familiar? Who's got the red flag counter up? Anyway, for certain prisoner populations, the Nazis believed in death through work. Many Jews were killed immediately upon arriving to the camps, but these gay, mostly Christian men were sent to die through work instead. Camps provided a force of labor for mines, quarries, and the factories that Nazis sorely needed. Survival was almost impossible, and prisoners really were mentally killed slowly as they had to watch the people around them die all the fucking time. Survivors recount that gays were often the most abused groups in the camp, both physically and sexually otherwise. Camp workers could perform castrations without consent starting in 1942. There was a pecking order in the camps as well. One survivor from the Sharmek Vorbuk camp described it and said, quote, "There was a hierarchy from the strongest to the weakest. There was no doubt that the weakest in the camps were the homosexuals, all the way to the bottom." End quote. Gay men were targeted by other angry prisoners and guards who needed an outlet for their rage and misery. Prisoner networks were important to survival, and because they were shunned from these networks, they often lived a life of isolation in the camps. Gay men were separated from other prisoners because the Nazis viewed homosexuality as a contagious disease that could spread to their other workers. At night, the men were to sleep with the lights on so guards could monitor their behavior. Men were forced to sleep with their hands on top of their blankets to assure they were not masturbating. If men were caught sleeping with their hands under the blankets, they would be forced to go outside naked, have a bucket of water poured over them, and be made to stand for hours, even in the winter, which is a really quick and surefire way to attract diseases. They could also be suspended by the wrists on posts with their arms tied behind their back. A prisoner at Sachsenhausen camp described these people who would be suspended from the poles as the singing forest. The howling and the screaming were inhuman, inexplicable, beyond comprehension. I actually looked into this, and the suspension by the wrists is a known torture technique that was often used by medieval governments. In this position, the victim's shoulders and arms would be dislocated, and their own weight would drag them down and cause irreparable damage to nerves and ligaments, sometimes leaving people paralyzed. And when left alone, this would sometimes kill prisoners within the hour. This technique has been used in the recent past, including during the Cambodian genocide, during the Vietnam War, where John McCain was famously subjected to this, and at the Abu Ghraib prison in 2003 by American CIA and military officials who tortured and posed with the dead bodies of the people that they subjected this to. Gay men were used in disproportionately large numbers for the Nazi, quote, scientific experiments. These experiments tried to, quote, accomplish multiple things, such as identifying and curing the cause of homosexuality. One method to cure homosexuality was castration. Some were even told they would be released if they agreed to castration. Later in the war, if prisoners agreed to be castrated, they could be drafted into the army, but this also meant almost certain death. Experiments often caused sickness, mutilation, and death. Himmler, our resident weasel, hired a Danish doctor to carry out experiments at Buchenwald to identify a cure for homosexuality. This doctor claimed he had implanted an artificial sex gland in the gay prisoners to stop them from their, quote, unnatural urges. This artificial gland released testosterone and other drugs into their bloodstream and was again unsuccessful. The death rate of homosexual men has been estimated to be about 60%, which is the highest of any non Jewish prisoner population, and the medical experiments certainly contributed to this. In 1943, a prison brothel was established at Flossenburg. This was part of Himmler's cure to homosexuality, and many Pink Triangle prisoners were sent to these brothels. The brothels were staffed by Jewish and Roma women from Ravensbrück. These women were promised freedom if they worked here for 6 months, but they were all just killed afterwards. Josef Kohout, also known as Heinz Hager, was born into a wealthy Catholic family in Vienna in 1917. Kohout tried to go out with girls, but knew by early adulthood that he was gay. He had a very accepting family, and his mom said to him, quote, "My dear child, it is your life and you must live it. No one can slip out of one skin and into another. You have to make the best of what you are. You are my son and can always come to me with your problems." End quote. Josef Kohout met and fell in love with the son of a high Nazi official while in university who was named Fred. Fred was 2 years older and was studying medicine. Fred also had a very masculine appearance and demeanor, was forceful and athletic. But he was very smitten with Kohout, who was very charming, and the two quickly began planning their future together. In March of 1939, the Gestapo summoned him for a meeting. At the meeting, a doctor just said, quote, "You are a queer, a homosexual. Do you admit it?" End quote. Kohout denied the accusation, and the doctor again said, quote, "Don't lie, you dirty queer. I have proof." End quote. This proof was a photo of the two men, Kohout and Fred, with their arms around each other, and on the back of the photo, it said, "To my friend Fred." in eternal love and deepest affection. This was a Christmas present from Kohout to Fred. Kohout was given a 6-month prison sentence and then sent to Sachsenhausen. In the transport train, everyone was pushed into crowded trains with other prisoners. On Kohout's train, 2 murderers mercilessly taunted him, and throughout the 13-day trip, he was beaten regularly and forced to provide them sex. Upon arriving at the camp, the SS officers required the prisoners to state their offense. As Kohout identified himself as gay, the SS officers punched him in the face and he fell to the ground. He was urged to get up quickly by other prisoners or else he would be kicked to death. All of the 175ers were brought to their block, stripped naked, and forced to stand barefoot in the snow while they were whipped. Most other prisoners there were political prisoners, and the gays were separated and not allowed within 5 yards of the other barracks. They would receive a brutal whipping as punishment. They weren't even allowed to talk to other prisoners either. Kohout worked in the brickworks or death pits and then worked on making a new firing range for the SS. As this was being built, he would have to witness the SS practicing with live targets. He was transferred out of this job when he agreed to sexual favors for one of the capos. In May of 1940, he was 23 and transferred to Flossenburg, where he once again tried to survive by latching onto a capo or a safecracker. The capo got Kohout an easy job as a clerk and gave him extra rations. By 1942, Kohout became a capo himself, which was extremely unusual for pink triangle prisoners. Officers put him in charge of a munitions factory where he created a strong workforce which helped ensure his survival and the survival of his workforce, which I think was also mostly made of gay men. He kind of gives me Schindler's List vibes. Because he was at Flossenburg, he was subjected to Himmler's brothels. He made it out at the end of the war after surviving 6 years in concentration camps. He managed to find his family in Vienna. His dad tried really hard to get him out of the camps, but was unsuccessful and eventually, before he got out, committed suicide. Kohout was the subject of the first account of gay men's experiences in the Holocaust. He released Men with the Pink Triangle in 1972 under the pen name Heinz Hager. It was only after this publication that people started paying attention to what happened to the Pink Triangle prisoners. Kohout was trying to get his government pension, but his time in the camps didn't count according to the authorities, even though former Nazi guards could have their time keeping these people imprisoned count towards their pensions. Kohout didn't get his until 1992, and still then he was the only gay prisoner to have the camp time considered as part of his retirement. He passed away in Vienna in 1994. Treatment and implementation of anti-gay laws in Nazi territories varied. In populations which the Nazis deemed as good enough and similar enough to the Aryan race, they would introduce and implement laws like paragraph 175. In other places like the USSR and Poland, these people were deemed as inferior, so the Nazis would not target the gay people in those populations, believing the homosexuals in the population would help destroy the people from within. But even sometimes in these quote unquote unworthy places, they would still imprison and torture gay men. Stefan Kosinski was 14 when Hitler invaded Poland, his home country. He and his family were forced to live in one room, likely in the Nazi established ghettos. He got a job with a baker to help support his family and then was employed at an opera house. Non Germans weren't allowed main roles in the opera, so he was in the chorus and he loved it. His occupation allowed him to be outside on the streets after the curfew for non Germans was implemented. On November 4th, 1941, Kosinski was walking home from the opera where an early snow covered the ground. He sensed and saw that a soldier was watching him. The soldier greeted him with "Good evening" instead of "Heil Hitler" and shook his hand, holding on a little bit longer than one would find usual. The officer invited Kosinski to a cafe, and he agreed to go. During their conversation, Kosinski admitted to actually being Polish, and it was dangerous for him to be out past curfew, but the soldier seemed like he would be willing to protect him. The soldier said he was Austrian, and he was named Willie. The two stayed until the cafe closed at midnight, and they were eager to see each other again, agreeing to meet the next day after the opera. They met again and again, walking the dark streets of Torun, telling each other the stories of their lives. I went to Poland in November a couple years ago, and the weather can vary quite a bit, but it was one of the most beautiful autumns I had ever seen. We walked the paths which divided the streets on either side. The tall trees lined the paths with their yellowing leaves illuminated by beautiful sunlight. The deep blue sky, every once in a while, also would shine through. Anyway, the nice weather caused the paths to become muddy, slippery, and pretty gross, especially on the less traveled streets they had to walk down. One night, Kosinski fell into a muddy hole and lost his shoe. Willie was wearing his sturdy army boots and picked up Kosinski and carried him to dry ground. They walked a very short way up to an abandoned shed, and this is where they shared their first kiss. The shed became their private meeting place, where they could hide away from the rest of the world and their prying eyes. There, they dreamt about Willie taking Kosinski to live with him in Vienna after the war. In April, Willie learned that his unit was being deployed to the Russian front, which almost certainly meant that he would be killed. Willie declared his love for Stefan and promised to write as soon as he could, but months passed and he heard nothing. By August, Kosinski wrote to Willie and said, "Dear Willie, I haven't had any news at all of you for so long. I'm so worried about it. I miss you so much. I think of you every day. I am always thinking about you. I pray every day that you will come back safe. I'm working in the theater as before, but I'm not going out anywhere. Also, not to the place where we used to meet. I'm just true to you and will remain so for my whole life. Please write to me as quickly as possible so I can be reassured. I can't sleep. I think only of you. With love and kisses, your Stefan." He put his return address on it, which is how the Gestapo found him. He sent the letter, and a few weeks later, he was summoned by the Gestapo and they demanded to know if he sent it. He was beaten and whipped with belts until he started bleeding and fell unconscious. After he awoke, he was later taken outside and beaten again. The Gestapo showed him pictures to identify further homosexuals, even though he didn't know any. Kosinski recounts praying that he would die to end the beatings. Nazis forced him to sign a document in German that he could not read, and at his trial, his mother had to watch as he was accused and convicted of being a, quote, Polish whore for the whole German army. Kosinski faced a 5-year sentence. They first sent him to Stom, Germany, a forced labor camp, and then to Grodens, Poland. He remained there basically until the war ended, as they were part of the mass death marches. His march ended at a prison in Hanover, Germany, where he escaped just before liberation. He lived in a displaced persons camp until 1947 and then went back to Poland. He unfortunately lived in ill health for a long time. He tried to search for Willie but was never able to learn what happened to him. In 1994, he said, quote, "To this day, I have Willie to thank for my being able to experience feelings of love as something beautiful from the very beginning." End quote. He died on November 4th, 2003, exactly 62 years after meeting Willie for the first time. Our last story will be of Gad Beck, a Jewish homosexual born in Berlin in 1923. Gad Beck had an Australian Jewish father and a Christian German mother who converted to Judaism. Beck also had a twin sister. They were considered half Aryan, so they weren't targeted as harshly as other Jews at first. Beck knew from a young age that he was gay. He always had crushes on men and boys from when he was a kid. His parents also knew early on and accepted him too. His bar mitzvah was the last happy family celebration they had. Afterwards, his dad lost his job and Beck had to go to work because there wasn't enough money for his school tuition. In 1938, the Nazis annexed Austria and the Becks feel a shift for the first time. They were evicted and forced to move to a segregated place called a Judenhaus in Austria. But by the time they tried to make it out of Germany and to Austria, Jews were not allowed to leave, so they were now stuck in Germany and homeless. By 1939, they were essentially being turned into slaves of the Nazi regime, and Jews in Berlin were made to work in the armaments industry. Now, for a second, I have to talk about Zionism. According to the Anti-Defamation League, Zionism is the movement for the self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. I need to make it clear that I am not necessarily promoting Zionism here, especially the way in which it has played out over many recent decades and for the harm it has caused Palestinian people. I will, however, encourage everyone listening to once again put yourself in the shoes of the young people who are part of this. You do not have to agree with them. You can completely disagree with what they're doing, but realize this is perhaps one of the only options they had to make it out alive or live their life in any sort of happy way. I'm not saying two wrongs make a right here. I still don't even necessarily agree myself, but let's take on some perspective here. Beck and his sister were part of Hakshara, which was a Zionist training and preparation center which got people ready to move to Palestine. By 1941, 40,000 young Jews had moved to Palestine. The twins went through training themselves but were not allowed to go. They did, however, stay involved in Zionism. Beck met Manfred Lewin through this Zionist organization. Beck didn't care too much for him at first, as he was quiet and somewhat awkward, but he realized when Manfred was inspired by something, he came alive. He had a great passion and fervor. They did a theatrical reading of the play Don Carlos together. I don't really know the play, but their characters were apparently the classic best friend trope. One day, they were reading their scripts, and Manfred leaned over from behind Beck's shoulder to follow along. Beck had a sudden realization that he didn't want Manfred to leave. The two camped out on the roof of the building where they practiced. They couldn't go camping as they usually did because Jews were no longer allowed to leave the city. They brought food, sleeping bags, and a guitar. This was the first night they kissed and perhaps other things, but it is not totally clear. But they both knew they were in love, but it took some time for Manfred to come around to the physical part of their relationship. But he eventually did, and Beck was not going to let him go. Around June, the time of Beck's birthday, Manfred admitted, quote, "With you, it's okay." And this is in reference to sex. Beck recalls this being very difficult for Manfred to confront as he insisted he was straight. We have no real confirmation of how Manfred would label his sexuality, so I don't want to do it for him, but I can tell you that he was not straight. The two young boys have lots of lengthy talks about their emotions and love for each other and how they're going to try to overcome things. They frequently had sleepovers that also eventually led to sex. In the city, all public buildings had to have air raid patrols. I'm not really quite sure what this is, but I think it was for the purpose of scoping out buildings. Beck signed on to patrol the Jewish buildings, and as Jews were the only ones who really did this. During his patrol, he found a cot in the basement that became their refuge, where they could forget about the world for a while. While they were there, Manfred gave Beck a small book he had made that carried anecdotes about their friends, poetry he had written, and drawings, kind of like a yearbook or a scrapbook. In 1941, Jews started being deported from Berlin. The Becks saw their friends leaving almost daily. The two boys were working in the armaments factories, and at this point, they couldn't go into hiding and leave their whole families behind. But Manfred's family received their deportation notice in the fall of 1942, and this is when Beck decided he needed to try to save Manfred. Beck told Manfred's employer about what had happened. His name was Lothar Hermann, a painter who had lost many other employees the same way. They mutually decided to come up with a plan to save Manfred. Hermann's idea was risky, but Beck said he would do anything to save Manfred. Hermann's son was part of the Nazi youth, and so they had an extra uniform lying around. It was way too big, but he adjusted it to fit. Beck would put on this Nazi uniform and create an excuse to convince the Nazis to let him go with him dressed up as a guard. The Lewin family were actually being held in Beck's old school, which was being used to hold Jews to like officiate their deportation or something like that. He made up a story about how Lothar Hermann needed Manfred to come back with him as he had hidden the key to some apartments his business was renovating, and Manfred was the only one who knew where this key was. Miraculously, this worked, and the two boys escaped. Beck told Manfred to go find his uncle and wait until he came for him, but Manfred turned him down because he could not bear to leave his family. Without a smile or a tear or even goodbye, he turned his back and left, and the two never saw each other again. There are so many other stories about Beck, honestly. Like, he is truly someone who deserves a biopic. Biopic? I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced. He participated in lots of underground resistance efforts. He lived in an apartment complex for a bit with his family, and there was an unused attic there where Beck hid other young Jewish men. This was especially risky because a young Nazi soldier named Heinz lived in this building. But importantly, this young man had a hump on his back. During an air raid one day, Heinz hurried Beck into the basement of the building, and when it was over, Heinz asked to help him clear the building and make sure there was no signs of danger. When they went to hide from the attack, Heinz admitted to Beck that he knew about Beck's mission to hide Jews there but chose to just not say anything. This shocked Beck. Very teary eyed, Heinz said the Nazis forbade him from wearing his uniform because of his hump. Heinz asked if he could help Beck in his plan to hide fellow Jews, and Heinz made it very clear that he was sexually interested in Beck. Beck was eventually caught and spent the last month of the war in prison. Upon his release, he made his way to Palestine, wanting to help in establishing Israel. He wrote a memoir titled An Underground Life: Memoirs of a Gay Jew in Nazi Berlin. Gad Beck died on June 14th, 2012. Fortunately, after liberation, things weren't over for gay men, and this was the case with many populations. Many Pink Triangle prisoners were rescued by soldiers from Canada, the US, the UK, Russia, etc., and homosexuality was still illegal in those places. If they still had time in their prison sentence, some men were made to serve out the rest before they could be free. Pierre Seel originally titled his memoir Liberation Was for Others because the 175ers, or the former Pink Triangles, had a very hard time regaining normal life after being in the camps. Gay men in the Holocaust were not seen as victims. They were seen as survivors, just as men with criminal pasts. The general population tormented them for their past. Folks in public didn't want to associate with gay men, and the government forbade them from having civil service jobs. Gay men lost voting rights and their academic degrees and did not receive compensation from the German or any other European governments like other victims did because they were labeled as criminals. And guess what? Surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly, depending on your prerogative, paragraph 175 didn't go away either. West Germany still followed the Nazi law until 1969, and East Germany had a less strict version until 1968. In the 20-year period of 1949 to 1969, 100,000 homosexual men were imprisoned in West Germany. And it was even worse if you were already a Pink Triangle, because that meant you were a repeat offender. 1969 remains a year of celebration for gay folks in America because of the Stonewall riots, but it is also a significant year for gays in other parts of the world because that is when paragraph 175 is finally repealed. For many years, giving a voice to these victims was difficult because many survivors didn't want to share their story, and, for good reason. Re-traumatizing yourself is not always a fun thing. They would likely face ridicule, isolation, and be shunned from society. These men also didn't want to spend time dwelling on the most intense period of their trauma when they had been trying to heal from the stigma unsuccessfully. The German government didn't recognize gay men as victims until the 1990s, and they finally offered them financial compensation in 2002. But by then, most of these people were dead or really old. Many memorials were put up in honor of Jewish victims, as very well deserved, but there was no celebration or memorial of gay victims until 40 years after the Holocaust's end. Gay communities were not allowed to participate in memorial services held at former camps or war memorials. In 1970, gay activists went to place a lavender wreath at an Amsterdam memorial, and they were arrested, with the wreath being removed and denounced as a disgrace. Meaningful recognition took many, many years. The first memorial to Pink Triangle prisoners was erected in 1984 at Mottenhausen, Austria. A pink triangle is mounted on the prison and says, "Put to death, put to silence," for the homosexual victims of National Socialism. Dachau, the oldest concentration camp, put up a pink triangle in 1985. Previously, a memorial sculpture was put together of various colored triangles from other prisoners, but the pink triangles were purposefully left out. Buchenwald similarly established a pink triangle memorial in 1990. Gay activists were particularly active in Amsterdam. In 1987, the Homo Monument was opened close to the Anne Frank House. This monument is meant to, quote, inspire and support gays in their struggle against denial, oppression, and discrimination, end quote. It remains one of the largest monuments honoring the queer community even today. In 1989, the city of Berlin put up a pink granite triangle plaque outside of the subway station which said, "Killed and forgotten, the homosexual victims of National Socialism." Thankfully, today, many of these monuments now exist. The Memorial to Homosexuals Persecuted under Nazism was established in 2008 in Berlin, right across from the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Here, visitors can look inside the memorial to see two alternating videos, one of two men kissing and one of two women kissing. It stands as a reminder that these very people would have been arrested and maybe killed in Nazi Germany. A nearby plaque reads, "Because of its history, Germany has a special responsibility to actively oppose the violation of gay men's and lesbians' human rights. In many parts of the world, people continue to be persecuted for their sexuality. Homosexual love remains illegal and a kiss can be dangerous. With this memorial, the Federal Republic of Germany intends to honor the victims of persecution and murder, to keep alive the memory of this injustice, and to create a lasting symbol of opposition to enmity, intolerance, and the exclusion of gay men and lesbians." And that is where I will leave you today. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Pink Triangle prisoners. I know it is not fun history, but it is nonetheless important history. And I promise next time the subject material will be a little bit lighter. If you enjoyed, please like the video and check out other videos I've got to offer. Subscribe if you like, come back, see what's new, and stay safe, stay well, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.